So this video is actually part 2 of what looks to be a 4-part series breaking down the interview that was done with Chris and Deb Sterns on Hidden True Crime. I recently did a breakdown of some interviews with Sterns' friends, and there were a number of things mentioned there that made me want to go back over Chris and Deb Sterns' interview on Hidden True Crime. So hence the reason we are doing that. I will provide links in the description for this video if you wanted to watch part 1 of this, or also if you wanted to watch the interviews with Sterns' friends. I think after I finish doing this series, I will probably go back and have a look at some of the other friend interviews that I didn't do. I've realised that some of those, a lot of people have commented that the friend interviews they won't listen to because the particular YouTube creator who has those interviews, they don't like to give that creator views. So I will do a breakdown of those other interviews that were done on his channel so that people can hear everything that was said, because I think it is important for us to try and get some understanding of Sterns himself, to try and figure out why this all happened. So I think these are important interviews to look at. So with that said, let's jump in and continue having a look at these interviews, or this interview on Hidden True Crime.
But again, you're dealing with this stuff 7-8 months ago. There's a lot of stuff going on that evening, especially, trying to gauge Jennifer's demeanor after learning that her daughter had been SA'd. If it was me, I'd be beating the crap out of somebody, whether I physically could or could not. And she was totally composed and
unemotional,
quite calm about the whole thing. It was just very strange.
He is totally spot on, of course, about Jen's demeanour after she found out about the images. But I just want to acknowledge here that this goes back to, in the last video I did, they were speaking about how they've completely come to terms with the notion that Sterns is 100% responsible for what happened to Maddie. But you notice that they're still coming back to Jen, and they're still trying to throw shade on Jen and still allocate blame towards her. So while he is 100% correct about Jen's demeanour, I think we can see that there is definitely a motive here in bringing that up. He wants to raise questions about Jen's involvement, even though they're saying that they believe that they now believe that he was the lone perpetrator, or whatever it was I said. But we'll see more of that.
Well, now that we're on this topic, there's a rumor out there about there being SA in Stephan's background. I think some of the rumors involve you guys even. There's rumors about
just me
giving him explicit material. Again, I can't use terms because of YouTube, but what could you guys set the record straight on that?
You bet. Number one, it was, from what we heard, it's Hustler magazine, the nastiest magazine that was ever printed. Never came home. I would never buy it, and I would certainly never give it to my child. I mean,
none of that material existed in our house. But I'm sure back then, that day and age, magazines tossed to the street in trash cans. Somebody has it. Other kids bring it to school. Maybe they even try to sell it, but certainly that type of stuff circulated and what have you. Have no idea where he came in possession of this, but it was not provided by us, and there was never any physical abuse or sexual SA abuse at home. None of that. He was always provided a warm, loving, caring environment.
Okay, I really think Chris has missed his calling. He should have either been a politician or a spin doctor for a politician, because he has this way of weaving words to try and de-escalate things and try and fix things, basically. But let's go back to Deb. It's interesting the way that she spoke about this magazine, because she started saying, well, it was, and then she stopped herself, and then she changed it to, from what we heard, it was this magazine. So wanting to create a greater separation between them and the magazine. Now, if you had simply heard the rumours and heard that that's what the magazine was, and you hadn't bought that magazine for someone, then you would expect the verbiage to be something along the lines of, well, apparently it was this magazine that he had. But she's very affirmative with it was. And because she stops herself, that makes me question if maybe this was another one of the things that she indulged him with. Maybe she realised that he was a little bit of a problem. Maybe this goes back to the story that we heard from one of his friends about him filming his friend's mother when she was in the bathroom. And maybe Deb's response to that was to buy him the magazine to keep him out of trouble. Because it's just interesting that she felt the need to stop and create that language that created the additional separation, instead of just continuing on and talking about it. Could just be an innocent slip-up, who knows. But the thing that I can see it two ways with her. On one hand, we do hear her talking about all that virtue signalling. We don't drink, I don't do drugs, I don't even take prescription drugs. So, and she talks about her whole religious beliefs and being strongly religious and talking to her God and all that sort of stuff. So yes, it is possible that she could be that vehemently against such a magazine. But when you think about the way they've indulged him as well, like growing up, he had pretty much anything he wanted. You hear his friends talking about how she was emotionally abusive and verbally abusive towards him, but then she would buy him all these toys and all these new sets of cards and stuff like that. You hear from her that she paid for him to get a tattoo for one of his birthdays, and I think it was Chris mentioned that they bought him a gun for another birthday. So they certainly, they were prepared to pay for tattoos and guns and stuff like that. So is it possible that she supplied him with the magazines? The other possibility is that Chris is very adamant about, well, here's different options for how he could have got the magazines. So he is almost admitting that Sterns actually had access to these magazines, and essentially saying, well, yeah, he probably did have these magazines, but he could have picked it up from a rubbish bin, or who knows, there's so many other ways that he could have got it, which sounds like someone who's just trying to be a spin doctor, trying to hide the actual truth. I could be wrong, and it could be that they are just trying to rationalise an accusation that is a baseless accusation. Of course, my question for Sterns' friend would be, Did he ever show you these magazines, or did he just brag about having been given the magazines? Because you know what teenage boys are like, and they love to brag. So it is also possible that he just was bragging to his friends and saying that he got given those magazines. But it's definitely interesting the way that Deb and Chris have reacted to this. Now, Chris also goes on to say that there was never any physical or abuse in the house. And that basically he was always provided with a warm, loving, caring environment. The thing is, we've heard so much from Deb that makes me think that she was verbally abusive towards him, psychologically abusive. I don't think it was such a warm, loving, caring environment. Sounds like she had quite a temper. So I would imagine that it was possibly one of those sort of environments where he never knew what sort of version of his mother he was going to get from one day to the next. Whether she was going to be loud, angry, yelling, or buying him gifts, which puts a child on high alert and definitely has a long-term effect on them. So I think they are not being entirely honest right now in this part of the conversation.
So none of that's true.
Do you think there were any red flags in that area in terms of, I don't know, maybe some of the girls he was dating in high school, or did you see any red flags about any unusual sexual interest or problems?
His first girlfriend he had in California, he had a big crush on her.
Okay.
You know, we met her, sweet girl. We left California when the state went batshit crazy, excuse my French, but hey, it's California. And we left there and came to Florida. You know, at that age, your kids circulate through kids like people go through revolving doors. You know, one kid comes in, hey, this is so and so, okay, and then you never see him again. There's a parade of those instances or what have you.
Now, it's interesting that the question here was basically if they had ever observed any red flags in terms of Stephan's sexual behaviour. And Chris once again goes into a big, long story that you kind of got to really concentrate to figure out what he's actually trying to talk about. So he briefly brings up a first girlfriend that Stephan had a huge crush on, but then dismisses her almost instantaneously. So what's the significance there in terms of red flags? Was there some sort of incident that occurred with this first girlfriend that they're avoiding talking about? Or was he just trying to say, oh, look, he was normal, he had girlfriends? It's just interesting the way that was put up and then brushed aside really, really quickly. Now, the leaving Kelly thing really has me questioning. Now, I think there was one suggestion at one point that they left California because of him attacking the guy with the knife. And that could be a possibility. Because it just sounds interesting that he's saying they left California because it became batshit crazy. Well, I mean, I'm not American, so I can't say that a state did instantaneously change and become very different from what it was already overnight. But it just seems like a strange excuse to say that you left a state. So I'm wondering if it is something where something occurred with Stephan and that's why they left California. Especially because of the context. He's answering a question about red flags with Stephan's behaviour. So why does he need to go from talking about the girlfriend, and he doesn't finish really saying anything about the girlfriend, his first girlfriend, and he goes straight from talking about Stephan's girlfriend to them having to leave California. And when you look at it that way, makes you question if there's something more here that he's just not saying. And I think the next bit that he says is an excuse that both him and Deb present, which I think is their way of trying to say that they didn't know that Sterns had an underage girlfriend. Basically saying that, you know, it was like a rotating door at their place with so many friends coming and going that they never really got to know who was who. Essentially absolving themselves of any responsibility or any knowledge of inappropriate relationships there. So I find that really, really interesting, especially because what you're about to see is Deb once again putting her hand on Chris to tell him to shut up and taking over with the explanation.
One of the dogs, a friend of his came in, an acquaintance of his came in, and she didn't appreciate him. She let it be known too, kind of nipped him in the backside.
She wouldn't let him in the door.
Yeah.
She backed him up against the wall.
Not coming in.
And nipped him on the butt until he went out the door again. And we later found out this was the same friend of his that overdosed on heroin and died.
Okay, so they're still meant to be answering the question in relation to red flags in Stephan's behaviour. And now they're talking about their dogs not allowing one of Stephan's friends in the house who turned out to be a druggie. Are they basically trying to infer here that he was getting into that sort of stuff when he was younger? Is that what's on their mind, but they don't want to admit it? Because it seems like a really odd thing to say completely out of context. The question was about red flags in his behaviour and more specifically sexual stuff. So what's going on with this talk? I can understand the talk of the rotating door, friends coming and going and everything like that. But why is this friend important that had the drug overdose? Is this... To me, it does sound as if they are definitely inferring that Stephan got himself involved in that sort of thing at one point in time, perhaps.
There is another incident, and I don't think we've ever brought this up before, and that is in California. He was walking down the street with a couple of friends and his girlfriend, and this man was very inappropriate with them, and I'll let Chris tell you the rest of it. But
well, yeah, cat call or something, and there's
lewd cat call.
There was a shout out to him, and the truck spun around and came back. This guy unfolded himself out of the truck. He was that big, and physically started assaulting Stephan to the point that he was choking him to death. As coincidental to that, we had just come back from Sequoia National Forest where we went camping with the church group, and Stephan had a pocket knife in his pocket and stabbed the guy in the chest to defend himself. The guy was later arrested for physical assault, and Stephan defended himself, but didn't realize that he suffered PTSD from that. I didn't realize that until several years later that he was experiencing that.
He was haunted by it.
Yeah.
There's this common theme of Stephan getting into trouble, but it's always the other person's fault. So this time round, apparently the guy in the car made a lewd, as Jen said, catcall. And for some reason, out of a bunch of kids, Stephan was the one that reacted, and Stephan was the one that this guy jumped out and attacked. Poor little innocent weedy Stephan who did nothing wrong. And you can hear in the way they're describing the story that they are trying to justify Stephan stabbing this guy. They make him out to be like a haggard. He unfolded himself out of the truck, meaning like massive, so huge that he had to actually fold himself up to get into the truck. And then it was just a coincidence that Stephan had just been to church camp, so he still had his pocket knife on him, because he never carries a pocket knife and otherwise. So he stabbed the guy. Well, we know, we've heard from Stephan's friend that Stephan used to carry a knife, and we know that he was still carrying a knife around the time that Maddie died, because he gave a pocket knife or some sort of similar knife to Chris before he was arrested, because he was worried about the police finding it on him. So I think we can be pretty confident that he always carried a knife. Someone who always carries a knife, well, you can expect that they have an intention to use it at some point in time. So no, he was not some innocent victim. And this is also very different from the version that we heard from Sterns' friend. My interpretation, based on the different versions that we've heard, is that Stephan was probably being a mouthy little shirt, and this guy decided to teach this little twit a lesson, and it went badly. If it's true that Stephan was so close to getting the guy in the heart, then I hope he did have PTSD. There probably would have been a lot of blood, and maybe in Stephan's case the PTSD was from being bested by someone, from trying to be the tough guy and having it backfire on him. But definitely I can see why anyone would have PTSD. I don't think that gives any excuses for his later behaviour in life. It's interesting that they're saying that the guy was trying to strangle Stephan. In another interview, Chris basically says that the guy was trying to beat the living daylights out of Stephan and was on top of him, and Stephan couldn't get him off. So there's several versions of this story. And when there's several versions of a story like this, it makes you think that they're definitely trying to hide perhaps the fact that Stephan was the instigator, and perhaps this guy did very little, and they're making him out to seem bigger than what he was.
He was haunted.
What was the, just to clarify, what was the trigger? What was the cause of that?
There was a very lewd remark made, and a shout back to the guys. And it turns out the guy was a meth, but a shout out to the guys that went driving by in the truck, maybe an FU or what have you. And they
Okay.
spun
Flipped
around
him.
and
They
came
flipped
back.
the bird. They flipped
Okay.
the bird, and he spun the truck around and came after him.
And Stephan was the only.
It's interesting how Deb occasionally comes out with these zingers that you think, actually, that sounds like the truth. They've been asked what caused it. And Chris is kind of bumbling around and claims the guy was a meth head. Well, in another interview, he said the guy was drunk. And then at one point, Chris is saying here the guy's in the car, so saying that there were more than one guy in a car. And still bumbling around as to what happened. And then Deb comes out with, he flipped the bird and the guy doubled back and came at him. And you know what? I think that sounds legit. It was so succinct. There was no trying to add any extra details. There was no trying to paint Stephan as a victim here. She's actually admitted that Stephan did something wrong. So I think in all this gibberish, the takeaway here is that what actually happened was that this guy was driving past in a car, saw this arrogant teenager flip him the bird, turned his car around and came back to give the kid a mouthful. Maybe he did, well, clearly he climbed out of the car at some point in time. I could imagine Stephan firing up and being mouthy, because we know that's the way he operates, and at some point in time it escalated. Stephan pulled the knife. Whether there was a physical assault at the same time, who knows? I can imagine Stephan being the sort of arrogant, obnoxious kid that for a older male to have to deal with a kid like that they might fire up and want to swat them down, basically, and teach them a lesson. It's the way of the world, really.
The one that was physically attacked. Karate or no karate, he couldn't get the guy off of him.
Well, he can't have been very good at karate then. I can remember in high school, and I was one of the shorter kids in high school, and one of my friends had just started learning martial arts, and for about 2 or 3 days in a row, whenever we were on a grassy area, because it was softer, she would come up to me, and basically, before I'd know it, I'd be lying on the ground. She never hurt me. She was only doing it for fun. But that was within just a few days of starting to learn a martial art. Stephan was able to retrieve his knife from his pocket, meaning that he wasn't completely incapacitated. He was able to stab the guy, meaning he wasn't completely incapacitated. So, yeah, he really can't have been very good at karate at all.
And how old was Stephan?
16, 17?
Maybe 16.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
He was a really thin guy back then.
Yeah.
You know.
Was there?
See him.
That was their edit there, not mine, so I don't know what he was actually trying to say there. But excusing him by saying, well, he was a really skinny guy back then, that doesn't cut it with me, because I've known some pretty tiny people who have been pretty fearsome when it comes to martial arts. It's interesting that we have one friend of Sterns saying that he was around 14 at the time, and you have Chris and Deb saying he was around 16 or 17. But someone who's got a better idea of that timeline, didn't they leave California before Sterns was 16 or 17? I thought got the impression that he was friends with Chase in California from when he was about 14 onwards or 15 onwards. So that would have him in California, in Florida, way before this incident supposedly occurred.
When you talk about the line that was starting during his early adolescent years, it sounds like, did any of that become criminal behavior at all, or did he ever get disciplined for any, antisocial or unusual, problematic behavior at that age?
No, that's the thing. There was never any issues with him. I guess a parent's greatest fear is that the kid becomes an alcoholic or a drug addict. I mean, I have conversations with other friends or what have you who tell me stories about not their kids per se, but other kids, and it's tragic what happens with these kids. They get started in this stuff at such a young age. There was an incident one time where we were gone for the afternoon and came home, and I went up the stairs, and Stephan was coming down the stairs, and I had to stop midway, and I go, "Whoa, time out. Oh my gosh." I said, "Come here." And I said, "Have you been drinking?" And he just reeked of alcohol. Well, apparently he spent the afternoon sampling every alcohol that we had. And we soon got rid of all the alcohol in the house. And believe it or not, he was heading out the door to take his friend home.
What was his age? What was the age at that time?
17. It was just before California. So I don't know, 17. And sent him to his room and didn't see him for 2 days.
So they've been asked about problematic behaviour, criminal, antisocial, whatever you have it. And they go straight to the drug addiction, alcoholic type thing. And like, well, thankfully he's not like that. Well, he apparently turned out that way in terms of his need for drugs, by the sounds of it. But way to go with the parenting skills there. I know teenagers will experiment with alcohol. They do that. You can't stop them. And I think a lot of parents are going to have similar stories of their kid getting into the alcohol in the house. Getting rid of all the alcohol in the house is not going to stop them from accessing it outside of the home. But the thing that concerns me with this story is they're saying we sent him to his room and we didn't see him for 2 days. Okay, yeah, you need to discipline your child when they've been drinking and going overboard with the alcohol. But did you check to make sure that he didn't have alcohol poisoning? Did you check that he didn't vomit and then choke on it? And sorry about sounding crass, but there's so many risks when children, which is essentially what he was. Okay, so he was a teenager, but he was still a child essentially. There are so many risks when teens overindulge in alcohol and they don't know their limitations. And sure, let them suffer the hangover the next day, but don't just send them to their room and ignore them for 2 days. How do you know that they're not killed over there? It's concerning. But do we really believe that's the only antisocial or problematic behaviour that Stephan ever showed? Because it sounds like, from what we hear from his friends, that there was plenty of problematic behaviours. And it sounds like he was already getting into the MJ a little bit with his friends. Maybe they just didn't see all that, but they claim that he's always been a liar, that he's always been manipulative, all this stuff, and yet suddenly he's the perfect teenager who the only thing he ever did wrong his whole entire teens was get drunk one time on their alcohol. I think that they're leaving a few things out here.
He passed out, and I took the friend home who told me what had been going on that afternoon. But that's the worst thing that we had experienced at that time.
Did you notice the qualifier that he slipped in at the end? At that time. That's the worst thing that we had experienced at that time. Meaning that was just the beginning of it. And that after that, there were plenty more things that occurred by the sounds of it. When someone says, at that time, it's a precursor to things occurring afterwards. I'd be really curious to know what occurred after that, because we know that apparently he was taking a 14-year-old girl out partying when he was 19, so just a few years later. So what was happening when he was heading out to those parties? And it sounds like Deb and Chris clearly knew about whatever it was that was going on after this one drinking episode. Okay, before I play the next part, just a heads up to watch Deb Sterns' body language as Chris is answering the question that John asks him.
When you have these incidents, did you guys sit down and kind of have a heart-to-heart with him at all? I mean, what was communication like between you guys?
Oh, we had open communication and dialogue with him all the time. What we didn't have from him was truth, or that if he was having a problem, he would come share it with us. He was very close and close-knit to himself. I mean, never came to us, very rarely, unless he needed money, that he came to us with a problem. Hey, I got a problem. I mean, I felt and told Stephan that, why didn't you come to me with this problem that you experienced on Sunday evening or Monday morning, whenever this took place? Hey, I screwed up. Oh, okay. Because the first thing I would have suggested is I'm coming there, and then I'm going to take you to the police. You got to turn yourself in. Let's be out in front of this. And I always told him to be out in front of this. The minute you've done something wrong, own it, fess up to it, and get out in front of it. And I guess he thought he was smarter than the average bear, what have you. Because obviously, if you look at the timelines and the sequence of the chronological narrative summary, what have you, is like, how could he not realize that his trail was being followed? They know everything he did. How can you, in today's technological environment that we live in, do you think you can get away with anything? You can't sneeze and not know that you've sneezed.
So before we talk about Chris contradicting himself here, let's talk about Deb's body language. Chris is claiming that they had open communication and dialogue with him. And while he's saying that, Deb is shaking her head. And then she's actually pursing her lips. There's something there that shouldn't be said. Whether it's something that she is wanting to avoid saying that is going to contradict Chris, or whether she just believes that what Chris is saying shouldn't be said. And then we have him saying the only thing we don't have from him, and you hear Deb say very quietly, is the truth. So now they're basically admitting that actually there's no open communication and dialogue, because clearly he wasn't ever telling them the truth. And they talk about him being very insulated. He wasn't going to share problems with them, and that they couldn't fix his problems because he would never tell them about it. Chris talks about wanting to get out in front with the stuff that happened with Maddie. Okay, well, I believe that in part, and I think there was an attempt to get out in front. but I don't think he believed he was getting out in front of what actually had occurred. I believe that Stephan lied to him, and Stephan told him something way less serious. And the idea of getting out in front in that instance was actually them jumping to help. And I'm not saying this with just from nothing. If you go back over my videos, there's a number of videos that I've done talking about Chris and Deb Sterns, where I've highlighted many inconsistencies and outright lies. But I just found it very interesting that while he's talking about open communication and dialogue, that Deb's language is saying, nah, that's all bullshit. Her body language, sorry, is saying that's all BS. And then he's talking about Stephan not being truthful, talking about them wanting to get out in front of the situation, and Deb's sitting there just glaring at him. And I'd love to know what is going through her mind at that point in time. Is her thoughts, if we'd have known, we would have covered for him? Or is she aware of something that we're not being told? Hence the reason she's glaring at Chris. There's definitely more there that is not being said. I do wonder though, he's talking about getting out in front of the situation, but then he's also talking about how Stephan was pretty much of a dumbass not to realise that they could get him on surveillance and stuff like that. So is Chris essentially saying here that he should have acted before Stephan did dumb stuff and got himself caught, and Stephan should have just given himself in? Or is he saying that perhaps had Stephan spoken to him, he may have actually pointed out to him how much of a dumbass move it was to drive all around Orlando with Maddie in the car, or to reset his phone twice, or to do all the many other things that he did, which have all been recorded. It's a fine line here, but yeah, the reason I question that is, like I said, because of Chris's actions and because of the inconsistencies that we've heard.
I don't know how he thought he could get away with any of this. So our deepest desire is to discover more about Stephan, learn from him. And we're going to kind of lean on you, John, to help us provide some clarity to Stephan. It's a son that we didn't know versus what we did know about our son, and the complete opposite of one another.
I can well imagine that what he's saying here is totally truthful. Imagine as a parent trying to wrap your head around all this, trying to wrap your head around what your child has done, even if, as in their case, what I would believe, even if you know that your son is a bit of a reject, to suddenly have to cope with the knowledge that he had been responsible for the death of a child would certainly be something absolutely monumental to have to deal with. And I can imagine that they're still grappling with the idea. I think when you listen to the tone of this interview, though, they're also, I suspect, seeking some sort of absolution. They're wanting someone to tell them that their parenting or their not so great parenting did not contribute to what occurred. So I think it's definitely a complicated thing for them. I think deep down they probably realised that having enabled him for much of his life, that there is a little bit of responsibility on them for the way he turned out. he certainly never learnt to face consequences for his actions, and that's on them. And I suspect that they realise that. And I don't know if they're just seeking someone to tell them, well, it's just, not your fault at all, or someone to help them understand how all that intersects. But yeah, I can see two sides to what he's saying here.
We feel blessed that we found you guys. You reached out to us, and it gave us the opportunity to do a deep dive into your channel, and it was a welcome relief to see the professionalism of what you guys put out there, and the fact that John's got a medical background brings a lot of legitimacy to your channel. You guys truly represent what we believe should be represented in these crime channels that exist out there, and not the circus that they do represent. I mean, but it's a shame. It's reckless abandonment that they utilize. It's basically inciting a lynch mob against us, and God forbid anybody should cross their paths, because they'll just attack you. I mean, you look at these broadcasts that they have, and then you just watch the thread of comments that are made as if they're really relevant. But I guess the people feel, and maybe you can answer this, John, is that why do people feel like that they have to lash out if not to make themselves feel better about themselves? I truly don't understand that. The fact that they spend these hours watching this stuff is just amazing.
So first of all, I wonder if he realises that he just insulted the viewers that he was basically trying to reach out to for compassion. Saying, that they spend these hours watching this stuff is amazing. Well, probably a lot of the viewers that were watching this interview probably spend hours watching stuff relating to Maddie's case. And there's a reason for that. It's because the large majority of people who create content and the large majority of people who watch that content are doing it for Maddie. We want Maddie's story told. We want justice for Maddie. We want everyone who deserves to be prosecuted to be prosecuted. It's as simple as it is. So that's what makes us amazing. What makes us amazing is because we care so deeply for this child, not because we spend hours watching this kind of content. Now, what's really fascinating about what he has just said here is that he starts by claiming that the reason they contacted John and Lauren was they wanted to understand Stephan better. They wanted to get a deeper understanding of him. Or this is what he says. And then he straight away diverts to the real reason that he contacted them. He sees them as, he's like, you're welcome relief, you're professional, you're legitimate, you're not like this circus, these other YouTubers who just use reckless abandon. So essentially what he's saying is that he's targeted their channel because it is considered a respectable channel. I'm sure the view count was also considered important to him. And he basically wants to use their channel to silence the other channels. He's looking for, it's like in the school ground when, you're looking for someone to support you in preventing the other kids from picking on you. So what do? You go to the popular kids or you go to the teacher. What he's done here he's gone, these guys are professionals. You have a journalist and you have a professional psychiatrist. They are professionals. That puts them above the other channels. If I go to them and ask for their help, then if the other channels don't stop picking on us, so to say, then it just is going to make them look like complete asses because we've reached out to this important channel and the other channels are far less important. So he's making it clear that essentially this whole interview was about PR, about trying to clear their name, and that it may have perhaps been a little bit less about finding out what makes Stephan tick and more about trying to clear their name and get people to stop talking about them. And he talks about things like a lynch mob and people lashing out. Well, I know that in the comment section of videos people do become passionate, and I myself do the same thing. I will make passionate comments, but I don't know if I'd call it a lynch mob. I guess it depends on what channels you watch. But definitely you can see the motivation here. They're fed up with being spoken about, basically, and they're also fed up with being seen as the bad guys here. Unfortunately, they portrayed themselves that way, and it seems that other people who know the family and who know Stephan have come on board and also portrayed them that way. It's not an ideal situation to be in, I'll give them that, but does it help to watch the channels that are talking about you and read all the comments? No. That sort of thing is better off ignored. And I hope that John and Lauren actually explain that to them. But then it also sounds like they have family members contacting them anytime someone makes a video about them. Given one or two comments that I saw on my last video, I have no doubt that that definitely occurs.
Don't they have lives?
Yeah, and I want to say, it's almost, this is what I've seen oftentimes in the true crime community. It's almost like you're damned if you do, damned if you don't. None of us can imagine what you're dealing with right now. Maybe there are some people, I'm sure there is a small club out there that understands a bit of what you're going through, but I would say the majority of people have no idea the type of situation and what that is like for both of you. No one, I wouldn't wish that upon anyone. And it's true, if you don't speak, shame on you for not speaking up, right? And if you do speak, they're going to scrutinize everything that you say.
Nice bit of diplomacy there from Lauren, I have to say. She's giving him acknowledgement of his complaint without being overly critical of other YouTube channels. I think there's a fine line, and that would have been a hard comment to say, because obviously in an interview like this, you want to keep the person that you're interviewing on side, but you also need to keep things going in a positive manner and make sure that there's no attacks on other channels or anything like that. So I think that was a hard one to tackle, and I think she didn't do that too badly.
Damn if you don't. So yeah. We've been handcuffed for the last 7 months, almost 8 months. We've been held to strict silence. And so I think we've been chastised, criticized for not responding, but people don't realize that, there's some legal proceedings going on here, and we don't want to misspeak And now that all the information is out there, not that we knew anything, because we didn't know anything until it was released to the public. So we're learning just as much as everybody else does whenever this information is released. Stephan is constrained to tell us anything because he's under instructions from his attorney. So
that definitely goes back to what I was saying in yesterday's video. He's saying here that Stephan is under instructions from his attorney not to tell them anything. And he had said earlier in this interview that he hadn't heard from Stephan for, I think he said 3 weeks or something, for a little while. And he believed, he was blaming it on the prison and the guards. And my thoughts were that based on some of the things that Stephan has said to them over the phone or in emails, that his attorney probably said, you're going to have to stop talking to your parents because you are admitting guilt every time you speak to them. I suspect that is what has occurred. It's interesting that he is saying that they've essentially been told to stay silent. And we know, basically, that would have had to have been Stephan's lawyer saying that, because otherwise, I mean, he's talking about stuff being released in documents and stuff and FOIA stuff, and saying, well, we don't feel constrained to be silent anymore because it's already out there. But it definitely sounds like they were being told by his lawyer not to say anything in case they misspoke and gave something away, which is what they actually did in this interview, which is kind of ironic, really. But like I said, those interviews are now, not interviews, those phone calls, etc., are now also out there, some of them. And Stephan definitely incriminates himself when he's talking to his parents.
And obviously what we have learned has been quite shocking to us, and very disappointing to say the least. And then of course now we're trying to self-analyze, what we did or didn't do that caused this, and we're not even sure. Well, we know we're not the cause of it. We're trying to pursue a conversation about an accident Stephan had 30 years ago as to possibility of causing this TBI. 30 years ago when Stephan had this accident, and just so the public can know what that consisted of, Stephan was literally run over by a pickup truck twice. He and a friend were playing in a parking area, and when he was 7 or 8 years old, the guy came out to his truck, a small Toyota pickup truck. Hey guys, how you doing? Gets in the truck and immediately backs over them. Pushes Stephan down into a bit of a hole in the parking lot. Drove right over him, and hit him in the head with the bumper as he backed up the first time. And then, if that wasn't enough, he pulled forward and ran over him again. The fact that Stephan isn't...
They hit him in the back of the head first, and then when Stephan raised up to look, he heard the kid screaming. He quickly put it in gear and drove forward and hit him in the front, and then came up over his body, up over his pelvis area.
The fact that he wasn't permanently disabled and wheelchair bound is a miracle.
Thank the mud.
So Deb's saying thank the mud confirms what the friend was saying about Stephan having been playing with a toy in the mud directly behind the vehicle. So it shows that the driver wasn't even at fault there. Now, it's interesting that what they've done here is, so they've gone from saying we contacted you guys because we want to understand why this happened. Then they go on the long talk about the social media aspect of it, and essentially saying they wanted to say their piece, and so they're using Lauren and John as a sounding board. Their way of getting out there and speaking to the online community and saying their side of the story. And then they're talking about how what Stephan did was shocking and disappointing, and how they're self-analysing and trying to decide what they did or didn't do that caused this. And then they do a complete about face. And we're not the cause. It's the TBI. So that now explains why Deb has been so busy pushing this TBI argument, because it basically absolves her completely, doesn't it? If they can blame it on the TBI, then that means that there's nothing wrong with their parenting. They didn't do anything wrong as parenting, and they can't blame themselves for what happened to Maddie. All the things that we've heard in terms of their parenting, apparently that now doesn't matter because Stephan had a TBI, and that's the reason, according to them, that all this happened. That's the reason why they are so determined to push this TBI argument, because it makes them innocent in all this. They did nothing wrong as parents. It's all the TBI. So we're starting to get to the root of a few things here. It seems that they wanted to go on Hidden True Crime to convince people that they were totally not at fault at all. And they weren't bad parents. And that they are being unfairly treated by YouTube and other social media platforms. And that none of it is their fault because Stephan had a TBI, and that is the sole reason for what happened. And yes, I have done a video where I discuss the TBI, which is in my playlist, because I really doubt that the TBI has had any impact on Stephan turning out like he did.
But there wasn't, when he was released from the hospital, the doctor said, hey, be cognizant of any difference in his attitude and his demeanor and such. And we pressed for more information, and we just told that he could have some headaches, dizziness, nausea, sensitivity to light and stuff, may not be able to wake up or go to sleep.
So anyone who's ever experienced a concussion knows that what Chris has just described is symptoms of concussion. So basically, Stephan bumped his head, landed in the mud, got taken to the emergency room, got sent home the same day, and was given the parents were given the standard warning that is given to watch out for concussion. They've just described all the things that would be on the tick list for keep an eye out for concussion. If he gets sleepy, don't let him sleep, because it could become more serious. All that sort of thing. The headaches, dizziness, nausea, sensitivity to light. It's all signs of concussion. The fact that he wasn't admitted to hospital, and even kept overnight for that matter, says to me that it really wasn't serious. So, I mean, gosh, how many of us have had concussions in our lives? So many people end up with concussions and don't turn out like him. Most people have concussions, they get over it, they forget about it. I don't think they've got a leg to stand on. Can we just acknowledge too that while they're sitting here giving all these arguments and excuses, at the base of all that is a simple acknowledgement that he actually was responsible for the crimes that he is currently awaiting trial for. They're not saying he's not responsible for these crimes. They're looking for excuses. And the big excuse is, we didn't do anything wrong. It's because he had a TBI. That's the reason he did these actions.
And there could be some other physical traits. He developed a tic for a while, and he outgrew that. He did suffer
PTSD.
from PTSD and also separation anxiety, but we just never knew what to expect. But they just told us to be on the lookout for things. And what we did find is that his personality changed. He changed 180 degrees. He was a high energy kid, full of love, laughter, and such, and to something totally different.
The troglodyte.
Now, sure, personality changes are something that you can see after traumatic brain injury. But like I said, he's described what to me sounds very much like a concussion. He talks about Stephan developing a tic, and I paused the video and made note of that, and next to that made a note of, well, that can be caused by anxiety or PTSD or stress. And then I played the video on, and he's like, he outgrew that. But he did suffer from PTSD or separation anxiety. So straight up, he explained the cause of the tic. Stephan was struggling a little bit with PTSD after the accident. Now, if we are to believe what Stephan's friend said, that Deb basically blamed him and told him he had problems because of that accident, then I can see why there would be a complete change in his personality. And it sounds like she has. I mean, she turned around, she just called her own son a troglodyte. So it sounds to me like he's had a lifetime of negativity from her, of her putting him down, of him being essentially victimised by his own mother. And sure, that is going to affect your personality. So I think when you look at the dysfunctional family relationship, then you can't turn around and say that the change in personality was caused by the accident. Now, the other significant thing that happened at that same time was Deb and Chris were going through their divorce that ended up not happening. And while they can claim that he wasn't involved in that, you can be sure that an 8-year-old kid is going to pick up on the vibes in the home. Even if at that point in time Deb and Chris were in separate locations, I could almost bet that Deb was not saying nice things about Chris at that point in time. And I wouldn't have been surprised if she was saying things about the divorce in front of Stephan. Or that she was possibly in an even more foul mood than usual and taking it out on Stephan. So there's so many factors there which need to be considered before you turn around and say, well, he became sullen or whatever they're saying. He wasn't the happy-go-lucky kid after that. Well, okay, that also coincides with difficulties in the family relationship, basically. And, you know, kids are intuitive. To say that he wasn't involved and didn't didn't have a part in or what was going on with the divorce is just a really naive thing to say. Of course he would have known. So I'm just not buying this TBI thing at all.
And then he started experiencing some educational problems, and Debbie can relate to that. We had to put him into an individual education plan and what have you. We finally realized that we needed to take him out of the school and put him into a homeschool environment, which was held to a strict regime, and Debbie did a great job of managing that for him. We also did as much as we could to encourage him to participate in sports. I tried to expose him to as much sports as possible. He didn't seem to have a lot of interest in group sports per se. Kind of gravitated towards track. He was fast. He was always fast as a kid on his feet, and in spite of his injury, he was a speedster. But that didn't last long because he apparently had a kidney disorder that required some immediate surgery, and he had to have some emergency surgery to take care of that. Again, he discovered an interest in Shokan karate and did well with that. He managed to get a brown belt in that, but we were forced to moved away to California. Well, actually, no. Where did we go after that? He was in Georgia. Yeah, we went to California. Mm-hmm. Yeah, my wife's mother was dying of cancer, so we went out to be with her in her last few years. But we later introduced him to scuba diving. We kept trying to introduce him to things that would be motivating enough to provide enough incentive to where maybe he would be motivated to go out and get a job and earn some money to pay for these things, because it didn't try to overindulge him with money and access to money per se. I was trying to use that as an incentive and motivation to go out and get a job.
There's so much to unpack there. You need to read between the lines a bit here. But essentially they're saying that he was unmotivated and he was a bit of a failure. They're talking about him having problems at school, needing an IEP, and then having to be homeschooled. Then they're talking about trying to introduce him to all these sports, and of course then you've got the excuse of the kidney problem, but then he still went on to try karate and scuba diving, and it sounds like they've allowed him to jump from one thing to the next, and believing that would give him the right ethic or motivate him to want to work so that he could earn money. Well, if he's not encouraged to stick with something and you just move on to something new when he gets bored with it, then you're not going to encourage the sort of ethics that a person needs to become successful in the workforce. He would clearly see no motivation to work because it wouldn't be anything of interest to him. He would lose interest and that would be the end of it. So used to being allowed to just change his hobbies every other minute. So I can appreciate what they were trying to do, but it's not really an effective way of doing it. And the irony is that we know they were still paying his way as a 37-year-old. When you look at the documents, the times that Stephan actually had his phone with him and they used the cell tower tracking on his phone, you can see that the phone is labelled as C. Sterns. So even Stephan's phone was actually bought by Chris and paid for by Chris. you have Stephan's car that he drove into the ground. So what do? Here, take our Lincoln instead and drive that. Apparently, they paid for him to stay in Jen's apartment. And then when he did get himself a job, they decided that job wasn't good enough for him. He wasn't earning enough money. There was no future growth for him in that job. Rather than allowing him to learn to budget for himself, allow him to develop a work ethos that might maybe motivate him to look for a better job down the track, what do? They make him quit his job and move home with them so that they're not paying rent for him and they can pay all his expenses. He wants to go visit Jen on the Sunday. No worries. Chris put enough petrol in the car for him to drive up to Orlando and back. Needs a credit card? No worries. Chris got him that as well. So what he's saying here does not match with what they actually did. He's claiming they wanted him to learn to be self-sufficient. They wanted him to want to get a job so that he could spend money for himself and enjoy these experiences. And yet they were going to give him those experiences anyway. What motivation was there for him to do anything other than to sit on his ass in his bedroom searching for images online, which it sounds like he was doing?
Obviously, that didn't work too well, but everything seemed to be focused towards solitary pursuits. We loved reading games, Pokemon games, Warcraft, and other things. If he liked something, man, he drilled in on it. He focused in on it. He really truly excelled at that, and things that he did excel at. Again, try to encourage him to assimilate a normal flow of life. And there was almost always a disconnect. It had been a very frustrating experience for us to get him to assimilate into a normal life. We're getting on in our years. We're in our early 70s.
There would definitely have to be some level of relief for them there. The thought that he left half said there was the fact that they realised that they weren't going to be able to continue to financially support him his entire life. And it must have been something that was really starting to weigh on them, being in their 70s. So I think, when the trials are over, I think there will be some relief for them to be finally able to breathe a little bit and not have to worry about paying rent for him or keeping his vehicle on the road or buying him a new phone or paying for fuel for his car. I mean, I guess it's, even if they are continuing to support him while he's in jail, it's probably cheaper than paying $600 a month for rent and paying for fuel and paying for an upkeep of a vehicle and all those other things that they were doing for him. But it's a bit sad. He's saying how Stephan was into solitary pursuits. In other words, he would hide out in his bedroom and do his own thing and not socialise. And he's talking about trying to assimilate him into normal life. Well, the problem is there. Your child is never going to assimilate into normal life if you continue to provide them with everything they need and not expect them to pull their weight. I've not heard mention even of him helping around the house. It sounds like basically when he lived with Chris and Deb, he was up all night, probably on the computer or doing God knows what and sleeping all day. So he was a major burden on them. But they created that because they continued, even until he was 37, to pay his way. He never had to learn to fend for himself. And, you know, I've had friends whose parents provided for them right up through their university degrees and everything like that. And, you know, they didn't have to work their way through university because their parents paid their university fees. They paid their accommodation, they paid their food, they bought them a vehicle, all those sorts of things. But at the same time, those friends of mine were taught to appreciate those things. They were taught not to take them for granted. And they learned to be grateful for what was on offer, and to understand that that wasn't a free ride. And, you know, there is a way of supporting your children to launch them into life without overindulging them and having them still living in your house when they're 37 because they've never needed to stand on their own 2 feet.
Yeah.
So you talked about communication was open, it sounds like, and you were able to talk to him about quite a bit, or at least when he was willing to talk. What about the emotional connection? How would you guys describe your emotional connection to your son when he was younger?
I thought it was very close and loving.
Yeah, it was really close up until the accident, and not that we changed, he changed. I mean, he was, you know, if you show you photos of him, you know, as a kid, I mean, he's running through the house on the tips of his toes and you know, just a little speed demon, laughing and giggling all the time. Really a quite bubbly personality. I mean,
Okay, that's disappointing to hear. You probably think, what is she talking about? The description that he's just given there of Stephan and his bubbly personality and his giggling and his running on his tiptoes through the house, does that remind you of anything you may have listened to in yesterday's portion of this interview? Because to me, straight up, it sounds like the same description that Deb gave of Maddie. So, is she really saying that Maddie was like that? Or is this some sort of ideal that they have in their head of what a happy child looks like? And they're therefore applying it to both Maddie and Stephan. I have to say, I am really curious now. I would like to know the dates in terms of when this whole divorce was happening and when the accident happened. Personally, I think knowing that they also did a lawsuit over the accident and got compensation, then that sort of thing can also cause stress. So them saying that it was a close and loving relationship up until that accident, I would like to know what else was going on in his life around that time. Does it connect with the divorce? Does it connect with the legal action that they took over the accident? Because, like I said, the description we've heard sounds like it was nothing more than concussion. And, you know, that's not going to cause a change of personality. But can we also acknowledge too that 8 is sort of that developmental phase when a child is going from it's in the middle of that phase where they're developing from an infant to a child, really. You know, up until about 6 or 7, it's a different type of mental development. At 8, you're starting to see the person that they're going to become. So it could just be that he was just starting to show his true colours as an 8-year-old, starting to test the limits, starting to see what he could get away with, just doing what you would expect to see developmentally at that age.
We discovered very early on that if he was focused on something, forget about it. You know, we were at a hotel one time, and he got the key to the refrigerator or bar in the room, and he was sitting there at the age of 3 with that key, and he was relentless in getting that key into that lock and unlocking that lock. But that's how focused he could be. But
Okay, so it's interesting what he's done here. So on one hand, they're trying to convince us that until Stephan was 8, he was Mr. Angelic. He was a good kid. There was a close emotional connection, and he was close and loving. And then that's when his behaviour started to change, etc., etc. But now you get this story of little 3-year-old Stephan having got hold of a key for a bar in a hotel room. Did they take it off him and tell him no? Did they take it and put it out of reach where he couldn't get it again? No. They're telling us how he was determined to get into it, and he persevered. He was going to get in there. So what we're getting here is an example of the parenting that Stephan received his whole life, and a glimpse of why he became that not so perfect 8-year-old, 9-year-old, 10-year-old, whatever. Like I said, 8 is sort of in that transitional phase from moving away from being that infant to being a child, where he is going to push the boundaries. And you see so many children at 8 and 9, that's when you start to see them showing a bit of a rebellious side. Nothing at all like what you see in a teenager, but you definitely do see it. 10-year-old boys can be not fun sometimes, and it just seems to be part of the developmental phase. 8 is already headed that way. So, to me, what I'm hearing here is a progression of a child who has not been given boundaries even as a 3-year-old, so that by the time he's reaching 8, he's playing in mud puddles in a car park behind a car and allowed to do so, getting injured. And he's pushing boundaries. And then clearly that has escalated. Whether they indulged him after that accident, who knows? But I think there are definitely signs in his early behaviour that show that he was no angel before that accident either.
We loved that kid to death, smothered him. What?
You didn't smother him.
Well, smothered them with love, whatever. But you know, we there was never any denial of any outward affection from him and us, and even to this day, still a lot of outward display of love and affection. Nothing, as I said, ever gave us any clue or warning to his recently discovered behavior. I mean, this, like I said, this is a son that we don't know.
He just totally contradicted himself there. He's talking about the change in Stephan after the accident and not having the same sort of emotional connection. And he's like, there was never any denial of outward affection. And, that this outward display of love and affection, which he keeps saying over and over again, has continued to this day. Well, hang on, because on one hand you're saying that all that stopped after he had his TBI and he became a very different person. And now you're saying that there's always been this sign of outward love and affection, and that there's nothing about him that would have given you a clue as to what was about to happen with Maddie. You can't have it both ways. He's saying that the TBI is the reason for what happened to Maddie, but then he's also saying that they saw nothing in Stephan that would make them ever suspect that these things were going to happen, and that there was always a loving relationship, and essentially saying there was nothing wrong with him. And I have to say, part of me says, hold your tongue. But reading Deb's body language and the look on her face makes me question how much of a display of love and affection occurred between her and Stephan. Because to me, she comes across as a somewhat cold individual, and perhaps even a little bit callous and not so kind. So I'm wondering about this display of love and affection that we're hearing about.
It's not the son that we do know. So,
Debbie, you even homeschooled Stephan for a time, and that's actually been brought up in numerous conversations on YouTube as well. Do you want to share a little bit about why you chose to do that and what that was like?
Because it was a daily fight to get him out of bed, dressed, and out the door to go to school. It was a daily fight to get him to do his homework. We had several conferences with teachers, and even on the IEP, he was not progressing. So I talked to the principal of the school, and I said, what can I do? And she said, have you ever tried homeschooling? And I said, well, no. Don't you have to have, a full college degree for that? Because I'm short a few credits. I don't have my degree yet. And she says, no, you don't have to, because you are going to be supporting him, but he's going to be doing his classes with Florida Virtual School. So that's what happened. And
now let's read between the lines a little bit here. Any student who has an IEP, well, at least in Australia, and I'm thinking from the conversations I've had with people in comment sections of my previous videos, normally an IEP comes with additional funding. Now, public schools everywhere are always fighting for additional funding. You need a certain number of students per grade to get your quota of teachers for that grade. If you have additional IEP funding, that gives you additional staffing. What am I getting at here? Well, she's talking about having had multiple conferences with teachers about his learning. She's talking about him having IEPs. She's talking about struggling to get him to school through the day, meaning that he didn't like school. He didn't like being there. And generally the kids that don't like being there are the kids that have issues and are therefore showing problematic behaviour. Going back to the IEP, how often do you think that a principal who's trying to balance the books is going to recommend that a child do homeschooling? It's not something that a principal is going to lightly recommend. It's usually a last resort when that child is just being so disruptive that it's making it difficult for other children to learn, or when that child is displaying behaviours that are causing fear for other students. So if he's being homeschooled, the school's not getting the IEP funding. And even if they still retain a little bit of funding, sometimes with homeschooling, kids will attend for a few afternoons a week or something just for the socialisation aspect of it, and the school might get funding for the equivalent of 1 day, so they'll get 0.2 of a student funding for that child. So to be prepared to give up IEP funding and funding for a full student that would then go over to this Florida homeschooling side of things says to me that he was a right royal little turd at school, and that the school were at their wits' end and wanting to get him out of there for the sake of the other students and for the sake of the sanity of the teachers. What does that tell you about Stephan?
And we were able to get him up at 10 in the morning. It was easier. So maybe that's coddling him, but it was easier on me too, because I usually don't go to sleep until 2 or 3 in the morning. So, hey, I didn't have to be up at 6:30 in the morning to get him up. He was able to eat food, and we were able to take short breaks and progress at a rate that would interest him, because some stuff he could just speed through. English language, sentences, reading, history, science. He loved all of that, and he devoured it. Math, no.
Hates math.
Math for me, no. So I called it a tutor. You're usually good at one thing. If you're good on the historical, on the English side, you're usually not good on math. I don't have a linear brain. So I had to bring in a tutor. But he had to take his tests orally with a proctor over the phone, and I could not be in the room. And did I help him with his homework? Yep, I did. Don't most people help the kids with their homework? I didn't do it for him, but I helped him.
I wish you were my parent, because I never got help with homework.
No. Anyway, I also gave him courses that they weren't offering in school. We did marine biology. We did oceanography. We did stuff that he liked. He loved dinosaurs. We looked into that. So I feel like he got a better education at home than he got in school. He didn't have the distractions. He could concentrate on his work. He wasn't distracting the kids around him, and he wasn't frustrating the teachers. But when he described his algebra teacher to me as a woman who stood at the blackboard with her back to the class, talked to the backboard while doing, combinations up on the board, doing algebraic expressions, and they couldn't understand her, couldn't hear her, and she never helped anybody do anything. And I said, why is he even here? You were still allowed to participate with the school because you were still basically enrolled with the school. So he still got to go to prom. He still got to go to graduation. He walked and got his diploma.
Got the cap and gown and the whole thing.
Now, I will say that I think that the current school model is a little bit inflexible. And there are children who would thrive were they able to start school a little bit later in the day. Were they able to have more breaks in between classes, even breaks in the middle of classes. There's a lot of primary schools in Australia that will have a fruit break mid-morning. So they might have a long morning session, but they'll stop midway through the morning and have a fruit break where the kids get to sit down and they have some fruit, and they might go outside and have some fresh air and a drink of water. And I've seen it done successfully in middle school with grade 7 and 8 students, where mid-morning they are allowed to go outside for a little while, and the boys go and kick the ball around a bit and get some of that energy out of their system, and then come back inside and settle in, and the rest of the morning is equally as productive, rather than having that part of the morning where the kids just become crazy because they haven't had enough time to give their brains a break. That is admittedly in regional schools where a lot of these kids have gotten up early and travelled for 30-40 minutes on the bus before school, so by the time they get to school it's already been quite a while since they've had breakfast. Breakfast club might be on offer, but some of these kids, that's too soon after breakfast for them and they're not interested, and they get to school and they want to go outside and kick the ball around. So to have a mid-morning break for kids like that certainly makes a difference. So yes, I can see that for a kid like Stephan, starting at 10 o'clock in the morning could be a good thing. I find it amusing that she talks about helping him with his homework, because in one of the other interviews, Chris essentially said that she was doing a lot of his work for him, and basically that's the reason he graduated. So I think that she's glossing over a little bit there. It's fortunate for him, by the sounds of it, that he did have a parent who was capable of making sure that he was having an adequate homeschooling experience and not just riding his bike around the neighbourhood, which occurs. But I do find it amusing that she thinks that she provided a better educational experience for him than a school. Of course, in his case, probably yes. But that doesn't make her better than your average teacher. That just means that he didn't have an audience for his behaviour. And I'm guessing that she was pretty strict with him, so he probably had no choice but to do his work. But then again, we heard that she also did some of it for him. I think in his case it probably was a good choice for him to be homeschooled. I do find it interesting that he was allowed to go to prom. I can understand graduation, but in terms of a child who's being homeschooled because of behaviour issues, being allowed to go to prom, that's a bit iffy to me, because it sounds like you're asking for trouble. It's not his group of friends, so there's no social expectations there for him to behave, and he's more likely to want to show off as the outsider.
Yep.
What was he? So was he in the virtual program throughout the entirety of high school, or just a few years? What was the
2.5 years in high school?
Okay. And you mentioned earlier that he tended to be a bit solitary. Was that after high school, or was he a bit of a solitary person in high school as well?
Yes. He had his cadre of close friends. He didn't have a huge group of friends. He had 4 or 5 close friends, and that was all he wanted in his life. Just his little circle of friends. He was not a social butterfly by any means.
And do you think that the accident had something to do with that?
I think so. He was quite gregarious beforehand. He would run. He would go and knock on people's doors and say, "Do you have somebody my age that I can play with?" He would introduce himself to people. He would run around and walk right around on his bicycle, looking to see if there were any games he could join in. Now, he did do kickball and stuff like that, and he went fishing. Taught him to fish. I was the fisherman, not him.
Okay, it's really not normal for a child to go to someone's house and say, "Do you have anyone my age I can play with?" And she's talking about him going around on his bike looking for people to play with. It sounds like he lacked the social skills to actually know how to make new friends and how to interact with children and to play with children, which goes back to something I mentioned the other day, which at the time I was extremely reluctant to mention it, and I'm still reluctant to mention it, but I do think that her description of him definitely makes him sound like he is on the autism spectrum. Why am I reluctant to say this? Because that has no connection whatsoever with his proclivities. Being on the autism spectrum does not make you do the things that he did. That is a personality thing that is totally disconnected from autism. And I just really need to emphasise that, because when you see people like Sterns who are so very clearly on the spectrum, sometimes there is a misunderstanding by people who really don't know enough about autism and stuff like that, oh, this is what people with autism do. And this is not what people with autism do. This is what a person with a sociopathy or even psychopathy does. That is totally unrelated from autism. So, in terms of her saying that he was perfectly normal before the accident, I believe that what she's seeing is, again, developmentally, when kids start reaching that age around 8 or 9, they start to notice the kid who's different, and they start to choose not to play with the kid who's different. And I think that may have been happening around that time also. So I think we just need to be very cautious when we hear her saying these things about even his change in how he interacted with people, because you've got to take into account a child's developmental stages as well. And if we do take on board what his former friends have said, it sounds like he was seen as the weird kid. It sounds like a lot of the kids tolerated him because he was Chase's friend. Chase is the guy that lived with him for a period of time, and it seems like it was that sort of almost a pseudo-brother relationship. Chase probably felt a responsibility because he lived with him to hang out with him and treat him like a friend. And so Chase's friends accepted him as that. So he went to parties and was accepted at parties and that because of being Chase's friend. And it's interesting that she totally avoids talking here about Stephan apparently going to plenty of parties. Now, something to watch when we go back to the video is what Chris is doing with his hands. He's really not happy about something at that point in time. Something to do with what Deb is saying. I don't know whether it's controlled anger or anxiety, or whether it's some sort of tell, because maybe she's not being entirely truthful. But check out what he's doing with his hands and let me know what you think.
I kind of was more of an outdoorsy person because of the horses, and I also got Stephan a horse. He wanted a horse, he got a horse, but he had to promise to work with me in the barn. And that meant cleaning, shoveling poop, bringing shavings in, hauling hay with me, going and picking up more shavings, which all the kids loved that because they got to ride in the pickup truck on top of all the shavings. But and now people are saying that sounds like just the worst thing I could ever do is to have him actually work to support his horse and to help me because I was having some physical problems from these surgeries I had on my feet. So there were some things that I just couldn't do. But he loved running out at night. He would just grab a hunk of mane, hop on their bareback, and they just run around the pasture. Every night we went out together and gave the horses peppermint candy before we went to bed. So it was, to me, that was an ideal life. He was able to go into the woods and go fishing, catch frogs, catch lizards, catch snakes.
I wonder if, so she's referring to her foot surgery as being concurrent with or around the time that these things that she's describing were occurring. And if you remember, that is also around the time that they were going through their divorce. So perhaps that is why we're seeing that tension from Chris, because what she's talking about there is that period of time around their divorce, and there's probably some more to the story there. Sounds like he was very much indulged by Deb. Yes, if you're going to get your child a horse, you should expect that child to feed the horse, clean up its poop, brush the horse, do all those sorts of things. But also just sounds like he was allowed to basically free roam. And, I don't see anything too wrong with that. I mean, at that age, I know I used to free roam. My best friend and I used to go to the local park and we used to go play in the creek without adult supervision or anything, because that's what you could do back then. So not necessarily anything wrong with that. But definitely I think that she must be referring to that time period when her and Chris were going through the divorce, and perhaps her buying him a horse was compensation for that, who knows. But at the same time, if she was buying him a horse around that time, and she claims that he was having physical issues because of his TBI, well, how did he manage that horse? I don't know. There's some things there that make me ask questions, that's for sure. Now, once again, we're close to 2 hours. That gets us roughly halfway through this interview with Hidden True Crime. So I'll leave it there once again for today. I'm definitely interested in continuing with this series, so let me know if you're also interested in me continuing to look through this series. I know I said that I was going to edit bits out. I don't think there was a lot in this one that was worth editing out, but I think with the next ones there might be a few bits that are worth pulling out. I'm not sure. So let's leave it at that for today. Thanks for listening. If you're new to my channel, please subscribe. Also, please hit the like button because YouTube loves it. That gets these videos out there, gets more people seeing them, helps me build my channel. And please do leave a comment. Let me know your thoughts on what's been discussed in today's video. So thank you, and I'll catch you in the next one.